April 1956. East Berlin, Altklinika district. Early morning. A Soviet soldier walks down the street alongside a telephone exchange. A routine patrol. Boots on cobblestones. An automatic rifle slung over his shoulder. Nothing remarkable. A quiet residential area, old houses, a couple of cats by a fence. Beneath his boots, 20 feet underground, American technicians, wearing headphones, have been listening to the conversations of Soviet military command for 11 months, 483 meters of tunnel, 12 months of construction, $6 million, a year and a half of recordings from Soviet military cables, conversations of generals, planning data, operational summaries, ciphers. Material that CIA analysts in Washington work through around the clock in 3 shifts. That morning, the Soviet soldier suddenly stops. He looks down. The ground by the roadside has settled slightly. A small, fresh depression, about 30 centimeters in diameter. He looks at the hole. Then he continues walking. But he writes a report. On April 22, 1956, Soviet sappers began digging up the street. By noon, they found a ventilation pipe leading downwards. By evening, they understood exactly what had been lying beneath Altklinika for the past 11 months. By the next morning, the scandal would make headlines worldwide. But no one knew the main secret. No one, except for one man in Moscow, knew that the USSR had been aware of this tunnel from day one, even before the Americans picked up their first shovel. This is one of the Cold War's coldest and most ruthless stories. A story of how one side built a trap, while the other stood by, watched, and smiled. A story of 2 years of eavesdropping that yielded precisely the data it was allowed to yield. A story of a man who sat in a meeting where an operation against his masters was being planned, and took the minutes. But first, how did this idea come about? And why did it seem brilliant to everyone except those who were about to be spied on? Berlin in the early 1950s was a divided city. The Western sectors, American, British, French, were separated from the Soviet sector not by a wall. The wall didn't exist yet. It would only appear in 1961. For now, the border was a line on a map, patrolled by checkpoints. People still moved back and forth, though it was becoming increasingly difficult. 2 worlds in one city, divided by a street. And beneath these streets lay kilometers of cables. The Soviet military headquarters in Karlshorst, in the eastern sector, was more than just a building. It was the nerve center for the entire group of Soviet forces in Germany. Communication cables ran from here to Moscow. All Soviet forces in Central Europe were coordinated from this location. Anyone who could hear these conversations would understand what the Soviet command was thinking and planning. American intelligence knew where these cables ran. British colleagues had shared the schematics in the late 1940s. 3 main cables. They passed under Schönefelder Chaussee in the Altklinika area. The depth varied from 2 to 8 meters depending on the section. The distance from the western sector border to the cables was just over 400 meters. 400 meters. Someone in the CIA, presumably Bill Harvey, the Berlin station chief, a man with a detective novel-worthy biography who had lost his FBI post due to alcohol and moved to the CIA. Someone in the CIA looked at that map and said, "We can dig a tunnel." Not metaphorically, literally. Dig underground from the western sector into the eastern. 483 meters. Reach the cables. Tap in. Listen. The idea seemed insane right up until you started doing the math. The Americans controlled their underground space. Dig as much as you want until you cross the border. On the eastern side, the tunnel would extend a maximum of 20 meters, the minimum section needed to reach the cables and set up a listening chamber. Soviet patrols walked on the surface, not underground. If they worked quietly and precisely, they would never know what was beneath their feet. In November 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles approved the operation. He named it Operation Gold. The British immediately joined in. These were partly their cables, their schematics, their Berlin. MI6 took on the technical aspect of tapping into the cables. The CIA handled the construction and financing. December 1953, London, MI6 headquarters. A joint meeting. Americans and British, 12 people, behind closed doors. On the table, a map of Berlin, cable schematics, technical specifications for the tunnel, and a step-by-step operation plan. In the corner, at a small table, sat a young MI6 officer. His task was to take minutes. 31 years old, neat, attentive, fluent in Russian, with experience as a prisoner of war in Korea. His superiors valued him. He had just been appointed to a new secret technical intelligence department, George Blake. He recorded everything, every detail, every technical parameter, the location of the tunnel's entry point, depth, route, listening chamber, equipment type, planned construction start date. That same night, the draft minutes disappeared from his pocket for 30 minutes, exactly long enough to meet a liaison and pass on the contents. Then the draft returned to its place. The finalized minutes were on his superior's desk in the morning. In Moscow, the plan for Operation Gold lay on the Soviet intelligence chief's desk before the Americans even had time to fly home across the Atlantic. And this is where it gets most interesting. Because what the USSR did next, or more precisely, what it didn't do, is a lesson in intelligence thinking that is still studied in intelligence academies today. The first instinct is obvious. You have information about an operation against you. Neutralize it, relocate the cables, set up surveillance in the area of the future tunnel. Let the Americans know their plan is compromised. Scare them off. The KGB did none of these things, because they thought differently. If the tunnel were discovered immediately, an investigation into the leak would begin. There were 12 people at the London meeting in December 1953. 12. If the information leaked that same day, the circle of suspects would be infinitesimally small. Blake would automatically be in that circle. The most valuable agent in the history of Soviet intelligence would be burned for the sake of one operation. This could not be allowed. Therefore, the tunnel had to be allowed to proceed. Let the Americans build it. Let them connect. Let them listen. But control exactly what they heard. This was a delicate operation. Soviet military personnel continued to use the same cables through which they were being monitored. Abruptly, changing communication patterns was impossible. The Americans would notice a change and start asking questions. Stopping all sensitive conversations was also an anomaly. Switching entirely to encrypted communications would be a direct signal that someone had been warned. They needed to continue talking, but correctly. Occasionally, they would release genuine information to convince CIA analysts that the material was authentic. But nothing critical. Nothing that would genuinely alter the balance of power. The Americans received an enormous flow of data. Hundreds of thousands of conversations, voices of Soviet generals, logistics, movements, operational discussions. Analysts in Washington worked in 3 shifts. CIA leadership happily reported to President Eisenhower, "We are hearing Soviet headquarters in real time." Operation Gold was a triumph. They didn't know they were hearing exactly what they were allowed to hear. While the Americans were building the tunnel, let's look at how they did it. Because the construction itself was an engineering feat that deserves a separate account. Early 1954, the American sector of Berlin, the Rudau district, the southernmost, right next to the Soviet zone. The starting point for the tunnel was chosen several hundred meters from the border. On the surface, a cover was needed, something to explain why digging was happening here, why soil was being moved, why trucks were coming and going. The CIA built a warehouse. Officially, it was an American military radar station, a large hangar, a perimeter fence, guards, trucks moving back and forth. Everything looked like a standard military installation. There were dozens like it in the American sector of Berlin. No one paid any attention. Inside the hangar was a vertical shaft descending downwards, a shaft 6 meters deep. Beneath it, a horizontal tunnel extended directly eastward. The diameter was 2 meters, enough for a person to walk, for cables to be laid, and for equipment to be installed. The floors were wooden. The walls were reinforced with metal segments. Electric lighting ran the entire length. Climate control was crucial. In the Berlin soil, summer humidity could destroy electronics faster than any Soviet sapper. Soil disposal was a separate challenge. 483 meters of tunnel yielded hundreds of tons of excavated earth. Where to put it so no one would notice? The soil was loaded into bags, then into military trucks at night, and distributed to various points in the American sector. Some was dumped in vacant lots, some used to fill trenches at other construction sites, and some simply driven to the outskirts. Everything was strictly scheduled, all within limits. Not too much at once, not too quickly. They worked only at night, day shifts at the warehouse for appearances, night shifts underground. Shifts changed every 6 hours. No German workers were involved. Only American and British personnel with top-secret clearance. 12 months of construction. In February 1955, the tunnel crossed the sector border, a line on a map that couldn't be seen or felt underground. Just another meter in the dark. In May 1955, British specialists successfully tapped into 3 Soviet military communication cables. It was precision work. Not to damage them, not to create interference, not to allow Soviet equipment on the other end to detect a change in the signal. They connected using inductive couplers, which pick up the signal without direct contact with the wire, operating on the principle of a transformer. Technically flawless. The first recording was made on May 11, 1955. Inside the hangar on the American side, recording equipment was set up. Reel-to-reel tape recorders, operating continuously, with each cable recorded separately. Every day, hundreds of hours of recordings were made. They were packed into crates, loaded onto military planes, and flown to Washington. There, an entire floor of analysts, linguists, military experts, cryptographers, processed the stream of data. Bill Harvey, the one with the FBI alcohol history, sat in his Berlin office receiving daily summaries. He was ecstatic. It was working. They were hearing Soviet headquarters. They knew troop dispositions. They were listening to operational discussions. He didn't know that Moscow had known about this tunnel 20 months earlier. For 11 months, everything went according to plan, on both sides. The Americans recorded. Analysts in Washington worked. The CIA director reported to the president. Eisenhower was pleased. The Soviet military continued to use the cables. The KGB carefully monitored what was being transmitted, giving nothing critical, giving nothing empty, maintaining a balance that convinced the Americans everything was real. This continued until April 1956. On April 22nd, Soviet sappers began work on Altglinicka Street. The official version, immediately released to the press by the USSR, was routine maintenance of cable infrastructure. The sappers worked methodically, breaking open the asphalt, digging down. At a depth of 2 meters, they found something unexpected. Then even deeper. Then, a ventilation pipe. Then, the metal walls of a tunnel leading directly west. A Soviet officer descended inside. He walked along the tunnel. At the end was a listening chamber. American equipment, cables, headphones. It was completely empty. The Americans had managed to evacuate personnel and equipment when they detected activity on the surface. Only heavy inventory and several thousand reels of recordings that couldn't be removed in time remained. Soviet officers walked through the chamber, looking at the reels. On them were the voices of Soviet generals. 11 months of conversations. The next day, the Soviet side organized a press tour. Journalists from all over the world descended into the tunnel, photographing the equipment, American marked crates, and cable connections. TASS published a detailed report. Soviet newspapers wrote about an unprecedented provocation. The whole world read about the tunnel under Berlin. The CIA remained officially silent. American newspapers reported on Soviet claims, cautiously, without confirmation. The State Department offered no comment. Behind closed doors in Langley, a post-mortem review lasted several weeks. How was it found? By chance. Subsided ground? A patrolman's report? Or a leak? If a leak, from where? There had been 12 people at the December 1953 meeting. An internal investigation began. Careful, without fanfare. Each of the 12 was vetted. Biographies, connections, finances, travel. Blake passed the scrutiny cleanly. No anomalies, no suspicious contacts, no unexplained money. He lived modestly, worked well, and his evaluations were excellent. The verdict: the tunnel was found by accident. Subsidence, Spring rains, routine work. A setback, but not a catastrophe. This suited everyone, because the alternative, that a Soviet agent had been in that room of 12, was too unpleasant to consider. The case was closed. Blake continued to work for MI6. 4 more years passed. In 1960, Polish intelligence officer Michał Goleniewski defected to the West. He brought with him lists, Soviet agents in Western intelligence services. Among the names was George Blake. British counterintelligence arrested him quietly, without publicity. During interrogations, Blake confessed immediately, fully, without bargaining. He made no attempt to deny it. He spoke calmly and in detail, like a man with no reason to lie, because there was no longer any point in lying, and the truth was not shameful to him. Yes, he had been a Soviet agent since 1951. Yes, he had passed on data on over 400 agents of Western intelligence services. Yes, he had passed on the complete plan for Operation Gold the very night after the December 1953 meeting. Yes, the USSR had known about the tunnel from the very beginning. The trial took place in May 1961. Blake was charged with 5 counts of treason. The judge read out the sentence: 42 years in prison, 1 year for each agent who had been arrested and died because of his tip-offs. It was the longest sentence in British legal history. Blake listened to the verdict without visible emotion. 6 years later, in October 1966, he escaped from Wormwood Scrubs prison. This is a separate story that deserves its own telling. A rope ladder thrown over the wall, a car waiting outside, several assistants from sympathetic nuclear disarmament activists. British counterintelligence would search for him for several weeks. He was already in Moscow. He lived there for the rest of his life. He obtained Soviet citizenship, then Russian. He worked at an Institute of World Economics. He gave rare interviews. He never expressed remorse. He died in December 2020 at the age of 98, outliving the country he served by 30 years. In one of his last interviews, he was asked, "How did you live with the fact that people died because of your tip-offs?" He thought. Then he said, quietly, without pathos, "In war, soldiers on both sides die. I fought for the side I believed in." CIA analysts later estimated that during its 11 months of operation, the tunnel yielded approximately 40,000 hours of telephone conversations and 6 million telegraph messages. For years afterward, recordings were deciphered in Washington. There was indeed a lot of real material. Not disinformation in its purest form. The KGB was too clever for such crude play. Simply nothing truly critical. Nothing that would have changed the balance of power. The gold the Americans extracted turned out to be mere gold plating. For several years after the tunnel's discovery, debates raged within the CIA. Did the USSR know in advance? Or was it a purely accidental discovery? Blake's confession in 1961 settled the matter. But even then, some analysts refused to believe. It was too elegant, too sophisticated, too cold. Soviet military personnel talked on cables that were being tapped, and never let anything slip. Not once in 11 months. Not a single accidental word. Not one. This required an unimaginable level of discipline. Hundreds of officers who used the phone every day and either knew or didn't know that they were being listened to. Those who knew were few. The very top echelon of the KGB. They remained silent. Those who didn't know spoke normally. It was their voices that the Americans heard. The KGB created an ideal situation. Real conversations from real people who were unaware of being tapped, and thus behaved naturally and convincingly, but at the same time, no conversation with. Critical information passed through that channel. Critical information went through other lines, those that the Americans couldn't hear. 40,000 hours of conversations. Real, convincing, useful enough to prevent the Americans from doubting the operation's value, and useless enough so that no strategic decision by the USSR was compromised. This wasn't counterintelligence. It was art. CIA Director Allen Dulles considered Operation Gold one of American intelligence's greatest achievements until the end of his life. The material provided by the tunnel did help analysts understand the structure of Soviet forces in Germany, identify officers, and track troop movements. But every time this data formed the basis of some strategic decision, Moscow already knew precisely what the Americans had learned, and they could act accordingly. There are things that make intelligence history a story, not just a chronicle. In the case of Operation Gold, it was a young officer with neat handwriting who sat in the corner and took minutes. 12 months of tunnel construction that the adversary knew about from day one. 11 months of eavesdropping during which the monitor carefully controlled what the listeners heard. And a 42-year sentence for a man who firmly believed himself not a traitor, but a soldier. He outlived the country he served. He outlived the country he betrayed. And he died in Moscow at the age of 98, in a country that was no longer either of those.